This is Michael Whelan, and you're listening to Monsters, Madness, and Magic, and hopefully you'll survive the experience and find some wondrous things in the offing. So let's have fun.
Monsters, Madness, and Magic.
All right, folks. Welcome to the Monsters, Madness, and Magic podcast. I'm your host, Justin, here with a quick word before we dive in. Now, my guest in this episode needs no introduction, though I'll do my best. Join me as I chat with legendary artist Michael Whelan about childhood creativity, rockets, the Twilight Zone, Elric of Melniboné, Michael Moorcock, H.P Lovecraft, the supernatural, including but not limited to psychics, a curious circle of cats found on his roof at midnight, and much more. As always, folks, thanks for listening, and if you'd like to help the show out, please leave a review wherever you listen to this podcast. Anyway, without further ado, here you go.
Greetings, boils and ghouls. This is your comrade, the Crypt Keeper here, reporting dead from the sanctuary of the strange. Tonight's macabre myth is a fright-filled feature, one overflowing with monsters, madness, and magic.
Why don't you take us back in time to when you were a youngster? You know, were you a book reader, fort builder, troublemaker, or all the above?
Not so much a troublemaker. I was too clever to get in trouble most of the time. I'm a pretty sneaky guy when it comes to doing shit. I learned early on that as long as I got good grades, I could get away with just about anything. As long as I didn't come home in a police car, you know?
Right.
So I was a reader early on. I remember before I could read, whenever my parents got a newspaper, I'd open it up to where the movie ads were and look at the ads for The Thing or whatever science fiction pictures were coming out at the time. And I think the first word I learned was from reading an advertisement, you know, for a horror movie or something. That was an instigation there. And so I started getting into science fiction, horror. I discovered Richard Matheson like when I was 9 years old, and I started reading everything of his I could get my hands on. Some of the movies when I was pretty young. Well, my family moved every year or so. So I went to 4 different high schools, 3 junior highs, 8 elementary schools. We moved around a lot, and I was always in a situation of being in a neighborhood without having any friends yet. So drawing and painting and reading were my favorite ways of passing the time. My dad worked in the space industry, so we lived near White Sands testing ground for a while, Alamogordo, and usually near missile bases or Air Force bases. So right. I saw a lot of rockets going up when I was growing up. So the science fiction books that I came across didn't represent fantasy to me. They were our reality, or coming reality. I figured by the time I was 50, I'd be going to the moon or whatever, but it didn't work out that way.
I was reading, you have an extensive bio, obviously, on your website. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your grandmother, because you said she ushered her children to work in vaudeville, so it looks like your family just has a deep history in the arts, you know?
Yeah. You see, my uncle Ken was a producer, a TV producer in NBC, I think it was, and I have 2 aunts who were well-known dancers, and they performed in New York and Vegas and places like that. But my father ran away from home, joined the Canadian Tank Corps, and before they got shipped out to get wiped out by Rommel's Africa Corps, he deserted, went AWOL, hitchhiked back into the U.S., went to San Diego and joined the Marine Corps. He got sent to the South Sea. He was in the 1st Marine Division that stormed the beaches. Well, they walked on the beaches, actually, at Guadalcanal and Tulagi and some of the other islands there. But then he got malaria and they shipped him back to the States. And they had a naval hospital in Balboa Park in San Diego, and he fell in love with San Diego when he recovered and made up his mind that eventually he would move to California. So after the war, he was on the GI Bill. He went to Princeton, got to actually see Albert Einstein, and he was an English major, but he ended up being involved with engineering, and that's how he got involved with missile defense contractors like Lockheed, and he was a company rep for Lockheed, and Whenever Atlas Agena was launched from Vandenberg Air Force Base and it blew up, he was the one who had to figure out whose fault it was. He was under a lot of emotional stress because everyone hated him wherever he went, because he was the guy who was going to point the fingers for the Defense Department and, who did what wrong. And, so he had a lot of stress and did a lot of drinking. But I didn't see a whole lot of them. But I did get to see a lot of cool things, missile launches and stuff like that. So it was very formative, in my youth.
He taught dance at one point, right?
Oh, I mentioned that? Where'd you find that out?
Yeah. I'll do some research,
Yeah, in L.A. He worked at the Arthur Godfrey or whatever it was called dance studio, and he met a famous actress who wanted to get him into Hollywood, and they flirted with that for a while, but I guess that didn't pan out. I've seen the publicity photos. Pretty handsome guy.
It just made me think, you said your grandma kind of tried to usher his siblings into vaudeville. Did you notice that he had a love of stage or acting or anything like that, even though he didn't pursue it?
He did draw, and he, the whole time he was in the Marine Corps during the war, he was sending letters to my mom. He always drew cartoons over the envelopes, and she saved them all. And I remember when I found them, I was blown away by how cool they were. He had a lot of talent, but he was, I think, too insecure to try to develop it. He had some definite natural talent in that regard.
You do mention that Vandenberg Air Force Base in your bio and how it was a big influence on your future work. What are some of your memories growing up there that stand out to you?
Well, I remember waking up in the middle of the night and the house was shaking, and looking out through my bedroom window and seeing the Titan 3C going up. I mean, that kind of thing has got to be a big influence on you, and it was making my bed roll across the floor. So it was such a staggering view. And so when I saw Invaders from Mars, there's a scene where the kid in the movie looks out his window and he sees a flying saucer landing, in a field a short distance away from their house. I felt an instant connection with that guy. And so it was a great leap of imagination to start thinking that flying saucers were real. And I wasn't ever scared of the conventional monsters like Dracula or ghosts or anything, because I didn't believe in them. But aliens and UFOs seemed a lot more plausible to me. So every town that we moved to, I would go right to the section of the library that had flying saucer books. In fact, I still remember the Dewey Decimal Code for that section of the library. It's 629.1388. That's where all the flying saucer books were. And if there were any there that I hadn't read before, I would read them. I was just totally fascinated. Between the ages of 10 and 12, especially, I read every book available about them. And some of them were pretty scary to me.
Right. Obviously being a fan of sci-fi, that leads you into looking into actual UFO cases like you just mentioned. Did any of them stand out to you, or are you still interested in UFOs and such? They're in the news right now.
Yeah, not so much anymore. I've lost my faith in them to a certain degree. I think most of them will probably be explainable by conventional science, but I always hope. Every time I go outside at night and I look up and I hope I see something there. I've had so many dreams where I walked out of the house at night and there's a flying saucer there or a UFO of some sort, and I'd make contact or some creature would come out and I would meet it. And, so that was one of the two major themes of all my dreams growing up. The other one was nuclear war, and fear of nuclear devastation. So I had a lot of dreams about atomic bomb attacks and running for shelter and stuff like that. For a long time, UFOs seemed really real to me. But then when I started to become more mature, and especially now in the digital era when everyone's got a camera on them in their phone, if there was really any significant evidence of their existence, you'd think that it would be really incontrovertibly documented, by people. A meteor goes over Russia and thousands of people capture it on dash cams and stuff like that, So if there were realistic UFOs, I would think they would be a lot more in evidence. But I'm willing to be surprised and disabused of that notion. But my faith in it has diminished quite a bit.
It's almost similar to the case of the blurry Bigfoot photos. There's no.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
All these HD phones.
Everyone's got a camera in their back pocket now. So.
Were you a big fan of the Twilight Zone growing up?
Oh my God, yeah. Scared the shit out of me, some of them. The one, Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, which is written by one of my favorite authors, Richard Matheson. There's that scene where he's on the airplane, even though, when I became older and I saw the episode again and realized how goofy looking the monster was. But when William Shatner toys with opening up the curtain, and he opens the curtain up and there's a face staring at him. I had an event that happened to me like that when I was a kid, and so it scared the living daylights out of me. I'm sure I had nightmares about it. I used to have paper routes, and when I was, I was in 8th grade, so 13. I had a paper route when we were living in Santa Maria, California, and I had a friend who offered to help me on my Sunday morning deliveries, and the papers would flop down outside on the street for me to, rubber band and everything around 4 o'clock in the morning. And so I told him, well, you got to get up really early. And I didn't expect him to make it. So I went out and I got the papers, and it was totally quiet outside. And I brought him inside and I was putting rubber bands around him. I heard this tick, tick, tick at the kitchen window. And I said, what's that noise? And then a scratching noise at the window. And we had curtains there. And I didn't want to open those curtains, but I knew if I did, there'd be a face there. And sure enough, my friend Dean was on the other side of the glass. He goes, ah! Again, and scared the shit out of me. And I was so pissed at him. One of the situations, there's going to be something on the other side, but you can't stop yourself from looking. And anyway, so that harkened back to that episode in Twilight Zone. And when I saw that, I said, oh, God, I've lived through that situation. Yeah, some of my favorite episodes on there stayed with me for a long time.
So, Michael, at what age, maybe it was your parents, maybe it's your teachers, when did they take notice of your work and they're realizing maybe you're not average?
I was artistic from a pretty early age. I remember going to see science fiction movies. Oh, this was before I was 8. And I'd come home and try to recreate some of the scenes that I saw in the Mysterians, or I don't know, This Island Earth, or some of those corny science fiction movies from the 50s. I remember when we had to move from Van Nuys, my dad turned over the coffee table we had in our living room, and he said, what the hell is this? Because all over the bottom of it, I'd drawn controls for a spaceship. And he didn't realize that I was laying on the carpet looking up at the bottom of that coffee table and fantasizing that I was in a spaceship going to another planet. And I drew the view screen on there with an alien planet terrain, pretty much influenced by Forbidden Planet, I would imagine, and a lot of controls and stuff like that. Because in all the science fiction movies I saw back then, they took off in the rockets. They're always laying down, so I was laying down on the carpet looking up at the view screen and imagining I was taking off and going to another planet. He never realized what I was doing when I was laying on the carpet looking up at the bottom of the thing. But so art as an expression, a way of expressing what I was seeing in my imagination, that connection was established really early on. When we moved, I used to do drawings for friends to put on their lockers or whatever of aliens or creatures and stuff like that. And so it was a way for me to make new friends when we moved to a new neighborhood. Mm-hmm. I would sit in class and draw on my desk or something. And I remember there was a show on TV called The Invaders, and I did, I can't remember what year high school I was in. It was probably a sophomore. I drew the entire time during one class. I drew this whole scenario where I made it look like the desk was cracking open and flying saucers were flying out of the desk. And the teacher called me into the class later in the day and made me clean the desk off. And I said, that's the last time I'll draw on a desk. From now on, I'm going to draw on paper. So it's something I can take home with me and, not lose. It was always a way to entertain myself. If I read about a monster in a particular horror story or something, I would try to visualize it, do a drawing of what it was based on the description. That was a lot of fun. Still is.
So you just kind of touched on it, but while we're on the subject, I know each project is differently, but generally speaking, how does the creative process work for you? Is it a concrete idea that you start with and then that's what's on the paper, or do you shift as you go, like outlining a novel or something like that? And how does that work for you?
Oh, well, it's all of the above. I feel every time I go and do a painting or some kind of art thing, I feel like I'm reinventing the wheel. And I kind of let what I want to see influence how I'm going to go about doing it. So it changes a lot from project to project. But I'm not trying to duck the question, but that's just the reality of how I don't really have an established work process. It makes me a lot slower than some of my peers, but that's just the way that I handle it. With a book project, it used to be I'd get a manuscript in the mail, some huge stack of paper, and I'd read the manuscript, do sketches on the backs of the pages as I was reading it, taking notes on what the different characters look like, and then I'd just try to do a cover that did justice to the manuscript. So it meant doing concept sketches around the same size as the book cover was going to be, and I'd send those to the art director. They would pick one, or ask for changes in one and send it back to me. And then I'd do a little color sketch and get to work on the final painting. But I knew, when my deadline was, and I had to get it done before the deadline. And when I first came out to the East Coast, I had already sold the rights to some of my work out of my portfolio to Marvel and to European publishers, because an agent from Germany had seen my work at a science fiction convention and started licensing my work to German and other European publishers before I even started working for American ones. Well, I sent a portfolio of slides to Daw Books. They offered me an assignment. This is when I was still out in California, so I sold everything that would fit into my Volkswagen and drove out to the East Coast because I knew I had to live out there if I was going to really have a career doing book cover illustrations, because all the publishers were centered around New York City with the exception of Playboy, which is in Chicago, and I didn't see myself working for them right away. So I knew I didn't want to live right in New York City, so I stayed in New Jersey for a few months. Then I started exploring in Connecticut for a place to move into, and I rented a house in Stamford and hated that. And we moved up to the Danbury area, and I liked that a lot. So I've been living here ever since.
In the mid-'60s, you moved to Colorado, and that was when you took your first drawing class. What did you learn in that drawing class that kind of propelled you to your profession?
I can't remember even how I found out about the Rocky Mountain School of Art, but we were in Littleton. I remember taking the bus into Denver and showing my portfolio to the teacher, saying, I know you've got an age limit. You don't allow students younger than 18 into your life drawing classes, but I'm really serious about trying to learn how to improve my drawing of the human figure. And I'd done some copies of Michelangelo drawings and drawings out of my imagination, and he said that he felt that I was advanced enough that I could take the life drawing classes. So I started going to the classes during the summer, and drawing from the live model was really a great experience. And he was Phil Steele, who ran the school, established the school and ran it at the time, also did comic strip work. And so when I saw his portraits and his oil paintings and also his comic strip work, and I realized, there's no division between one and the other. It's all art, whether you're doing oil paintings, for people or book covers or, so I when I started buying Creepy and Eerie magazine, looking at the Frazetta covers, I realized for me, it was all art. It was all fine art, whether it was, for a comic strip or the cover of Creepy or Eerie or a paperback book or something that hangs in a museum. I didn't see a dividing line. So anyway, it was a great influence on me. It really sharpened up my abilities, and it really gave me a boost in my ego to have an artist like that kind of take me under his wing. And so I took a summer's worth of art classes at the Rocky Mountain School of Art, and it was a big influence to me. But I have to say, at the same time, I didn't ever see myself doing that as a career. It kind of indoctrinated into me from youth that I had to be something professional, like a doctor or a lawyer or something like that. And if I did art, it would be a hobby, not a...
When did you realize that you could do it as a profession?
During the second semester of my junior year in college. I tried combining my love of art and biology together and doing medical illustration for the Journal of Bone and Joint Surgery and some other things. I had a work-study program, a job working for 3 years in the anatomy department at San Jose State. That was a really great education too, but it wasn't creative enough for me. And I decided, you know what, I'm going to just throw all my effort into developing my art talent, my art career, and following my desire to do book covers. I changed my major from pre-med biology major to art, and followed that and haven't looked back since then. But I've always loved biology, especially human biology, anatomy and physiology. It's been an interest of mine ever since I was 10 years old or whatever. I used to read biology books and anatomy books. I immersed myself in medical illustration when I was in college. Used to read avidly all the Frank Netter, who was the master, the Da Vinci of medical illustration. All the Frank Netter books had the complete set of all his medical illustrations at San Jose State. And that'd be what I'd be reading while I was having my lunch in the anatomy rooms. I used to help prepare cadavers for the classes. And my specialty was doing hand surgery. And so I did some hand dissection. And, we used to dismember cadavers and have to skin them and stuff like that. And I had a lot of horror experience.
Yeah, that helps a lot, I bet.
And I can't believe it now in retrospect, but I can't imagine eating my lunch and getting a call to go fetch a head out of the refrigerator and bring it over to the classroom. And I'd do it and go back to eating my lunch, and it didn't affect me. But now, looking back at it, I think I'm more squeamish now than I was in my late teens and early 20s.
That's very Herbert West of you. Before we get too far from the early years, I have to ask. I got to ask about your rock band years in high school.
Oh God. Well, I tried to play guitar. I never got very good at it. I spent most of my time playing the tambourine and singing, but I tried to fill in on bass once in a while. I love playing bass. It was really fun, but I never felt like I achieved any serious proficiency in it. I begged my parents to get me into a music class, and I really wanted to learn keyboards because what our band needed was like an organ or a piano player. I swore that that was going to be the role I had filled, and I scored really highly in a musical aptitude test when I was very young, and I had music teachers calling out my teacher saying, "You got to get your son into a violin class or whatever," and they never did it, and I hold that against them. That's one two things that really pissed me off when I think about it, and that I lost a really good chance to learn how to read music and become apt. Have some aptitude on some kind of instrument back then, but I've always wanted to go back to it, and I never have.
Well, you still got a chance. You're still young.
Yeah. A room full of synthesizers. A lot of my early assignments selling rights to my artwork to Roadrunner Records for Sepultura albums and stuff were done in exchange for shopping sprees and Manny's Music in New York, and I would get a Wave Station or a Korg synthesizer.
Wow, that's great.
Instead of taking payment, and that for me was, I love synths and I love creating things. Someone asked Gary Newman if he was a musician. He said, "No, I'm more of an arranger of noises," and I felt like that described me too. I love electronic music, all kinds of combinations of electronic music and heavy stuff. Really grabs me. So I toyed around composing stuff on synths a lot during the 80s, but art ate up my life after a while. It got to be that I didn't have time for it, and I thought, well, after the kids go off to college, and that'll have all this time to create some music, and I haven't really taken advantage of the time that I've had since then, much to my dismay, but oh well.
What are your Desert Island albums? Just a handful of them.
Oh God. David Bowie's Low album, the soundtrack to 2001, Pretty Hate Music by Nine Inch Nails by Trent Reznor. God, if I had to narrow it down to 5 albums, the White Album by the Beatles, it changes a lot. It depends on what I'm going through and what I'm trying to paint or create or what kind of worlds I'm in. If I'm going through a real heavy science fiction phase, and I want to hear more electronic stuff. I love Higher Intelligence Agency and some of the hardcore electronic groups from the 80s, Depeche Mode and people like that. But I really love guitar, Joe Satriani and Steve Vai and Gary Moore and people like that. And Hendrix were huge inspirations for me and continue to be. When I'm in the mood and I need to really get myself energized, I'll put on Sepultura. I love Roots and Chaos AD and some Sirathungal. I usually stay away from Sirathungal except in the summertime for some reason. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I need to energize myself, so I'll get into metal bands. What can I say? That kind of music really grabs me. But in the wintertime, I'll be more ambient. And trying to get into just ambient stuff that creates a feeling of being in a cockpit of a spaceship or on a desert planet, with windstorms and stuff like that. So there's a lot of variety there, and it's constantly shifting. So my answer to that question would vary a lot from different times of the year and different projects that I'm working on. Right now, I'm working on creating a book cover for a limited edition release of At the Mountains of Madness by H.P. Lovecraft. So I'm setting up CD or a playlist of all kinds of strange, Lustmord and people like that, very ambient, Lovecraftian sounding music. There's a guy very experimental electronic musician who came out with an album about 1970 or 71, and it was called In Tropical Paradise, and his name is Douglas Leedy, and he has one whole side of an LP called White Landscape, and it's just these roaring wind sounds it's hard to explain. But in between the noises, you hear strange background noises that sound like chains rattling or the call of some kind of weird alien beast way in the distance. And it was so evocative to me that I set about recreating. I couldn't find the album when I got older, and by the time I was living here in Danbury, I decided, so that's part of the reason I got the synths that I got. I got wave stations and things like that so that I could recreate those kinds of sounds. And I made a 3-hour digital sounds trying to recreate and amplify the feeling that I had with White Landscape. And I got into sampling a lot of different noises, the sounds of crows, and then distorting the sounds and creating. And boy, talk about a rabbit hole. When you get into sound design,
Oh yeah, man.
oh my God, it's so much fun, but it's like a wormhole. You get in there, and I found myself spending weeks recreating or creating noises and going backwards and forwards and filtering them all kinds of strange ways. And by the time I come out of the wormhole, I've created maybe 3 minutes more music. But it's the same with art. When you get into digital art, having the ability to do non-destructive editing of art, man, you can get into something and get lost, and start editing pictures pixel by pixel, and it's crazy. If you can get obsessive in it, and it's hard to step back and say, wait a minute, I gotta focus on the big picture, not on how this one hair looks on the edge of this tentacle, way over on the left side of the picture. It's really easy to get obsessive about details, both in sound design or music or in art, in digital technology. It's amazing.
You're working on some Lovecraft stuff. When we get out of here, I'll send you a link via email to a guy. He is a orchestral Lovecraftian composer. His first name is Graham. His last name is escaping me right now. I don't want to spend too much time looking it up, but yeah, he's very, very great. That might be something that you'd like.
I'm sure it would be.
Yeah, I'm going to send you that. So when you're putting paint on canvas, when you're working, are you listening to music, or is it just to
all the
build
time?
up?
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you specifically about Elric. How did that relationship with Moorcock and Elric get established, and how did you see Elric and make him?
Well, the books are so visual. Some of those fantasy books that I was called upon to illustrate in the late 70s, early 80s are so, I see a movie in my head while I'm reading the book. That's really what it's like. And I'm just taking a still out of that movie that's running in my head and trying to move around it, kind of like moving around your camera in a 3D program to visualize what the best angle of view would be to visualize that scene or that experience. So as I'm reading the books, I'm doing little sketches, from episodes or scenes, and there's a scene like on every page that you could turn into a book cover. So it's hard. Thank goodness the Elric books are only 120 pages long or whatever. When I'm doing a Brandon Sanderson book and it's 1,100 pages, how do you distill that into a single image? It's almost a Herculean task. But I had a visual idea of what Elric would look like pretty early on, and he had, the goth feeling to me that had to come out in the pictures. So it's just a matter of painting what I saw in my head, trying to figure out the best angle. And, with Sailor in the Seas of Fate, having him looming above you, and seeing the back of the ship that he's on, I thought would be the best way to capture the feeling of his menace and pathos, in one scene. And I feel I was more successful in that cover and in Stormbringer than in some of the others. But I have a feeling that I'll always be going back to doing another Elric. I've got concept renderings, in files of paintings I'd love to develop someday. There's one in particular of Elric as an older person. And his hair is long, and he's got a white beard that he's got tied into these gothic knots and stuff. And he's still got Stormbringer with him, and it's still giving him strength to move on through his life. And I really want to do that painting. I've got a 18 by 24 depiction of that scene sitting in my studio, and I look at it and say, maybe tomorrow I'll get to it. But it's there, it's in my head, just waiting to come out. But I've got so many other things that are in there calling at me that I just keep putting it off. I'd like to do another one one just in case Sirathungo comes up with another album. I'd have another image for them to use on an album cover. Like I said, there's so many other things that I want to do that gets put aside for a later date.
Do you have a relationship with Michael Moorcock? Have you guys ever spoken? Nothing?
None whatsoever.
Wow, that's hard to believe.
I met him once, maybe twice. If I met him again, I can't remember the second time. But the one time I recall meeting him, he was signing autographs at Forbidden Planet in New York City, or some bookstore anyway. And I thought, oh, geez, I'll take my painting there and have him sign the bottom of my painting. It'd be really cool, as a fan. So I brought with me the actual painting to Sailor and Seas of Fate. And he was obviously under the influence of something. What, I don't know. But by the time I got to the head of the line, I don't know whether it was alcohol or dope or whatever, but he looked at the painting and he took out his pen and he signed it right across the middle of the painting, his signature in ink, all across the front of the painting, covering, it wasn't a print. I told him, this is a painting. It really pissed me off. It was so cavalier because I put so much heart into the painting. So when I got home, I got a wet sponge full of hot water and went over it and got all the ink off. And I said, well, that's the last time I'll ask an author to sign a painting of mine. That really pissed me off. It doesn't mean I haven't enjoyed reading the other books that he did, but kind of
I can understand.
Ruined my
that just made my head hurt. Do you have a favorite Elric story?
The Vanishing Tower. The stories in that book grabbed me the most, but the first three books and Stormbringer really were my favorites. I'd be hard pressed to pick one over the other, but The Vanishing Tower, I'd say, was my favorite. I'd have to read them all over again. It's been years since I've read them now. So
we mentioned Lovecraft a few minutes ago. I wanted to ask you about the illustrations for the Del Rey books. Now, how did you pull those images and put those onto the covers?
I don't know. Do you know how the assignment came about?
I don't.
I've been doing, for years I've been doing the cover. My favorite assignment every year came in around March. DAW Books would contact me and they wanted a cover for their upcoming DAW's Year's Best Horror Stories anthology. And I loved it because I had the freedom to do whatever I wanted. As long as it conveyed a feeling of horror, the illustration didn't have to touch on any of the specifics of any of the stories in the book. A lot of the times the books hadn't been put together when I was called upon to do the cover, so I didn't have stories to draw upon anyway. But so I'd do anywhere from, I think the least number of sketches or concept renderings I did for a book cover, probably 5 to 12 or 15 concepts, all of different approaches for a horror stories cover. And they would be largely influenced by things that were going through my life at the time. And I remember one book cover was influenced by hearing about thinking about the death of Jimi Hendrix. And I wanted to do an allegory about drug use or whatever. So I did a book cover that had all kinds of symbols about drugs and drug use. But that was all secondary. That was for me. But the horrific figure in the center, conveyed a feeling of death and horror and nightmare. And that was the important thing for the publisher. So that worked. Anyway, I'd been doing these Year's Best Horror Stories covers for a while, but Judy Lynn Del Rey, the editor-in-chief of Del Rey Books, got the rights to publish the Lovecraft novels or books. She didn't know who to go to for the covers, and she was having lunch with Ellen Dean Foster, and she asked Alan, who do you think I should get to do the Lovecraft covers? Do you know anybody who's good at doing horror? And he said, well, you've hired Michael Whelan to do artwork. Why don't you have him do the covers? And she said, he does horror? She had no idea. So when she found out that I've done some horror things, she said, look, she called me up and I came into the office with her and the art director, and they said, we've got 7 books we need book covers for, but we've got a budget for 2 covers. What can you do? And I said, well, I'll do 2 paintings full of horrible things. I'll do them in black and white and 1 color, red, and so that your production costs wouldn't be high. You can take whatever spot illustrations you want out of the 2 panels that I do, and hopefully they'll supply enough images for the 7 book covers. So I went home and I covered all the windows in my studio. When it came time for me to do the paintings, I covered the windows with aluminum foil because at this point, I think it was May when I was doing the covers, and spring was blooming and birds were chirping outside, and I needed to get into the mood. I put on the darkest music I could find. Mostly it was Klaus Schulze from his X album and some other dark electronic music. And I cranked up my airbrush and got some other paints going, and black and white paints, and I had these two panels in front of me, and I just started painting onto them without any preliminary work. One thing became a big eye. One space suggested a tree that was dwarfed and contorted and had human figures or eyeballs in it, and these big teeth erupting out of the ground, and a figure behind a window, and a human sacrifice way in the distance, and bats flying up and stuff like that. And it just came out. It was like I made my own dark clouds, so to speak, and created images that I saw in the clouds, like people do. And they were all dark horror things that I don't know where they came from. Yeah, there was an insect on top of a crate full of people trying to get out with, and so the hands are sticking out between the boards, and I can't tell you where they came from, my dreams or my warped imagination. And so I got the two panels done, and I created them so that one bled into the other. So if you wanted to, you could take prints of the two images and put them together and create a 360-degree seamless panorama of horrible things and dreamlike nightmare things. They successfully used them on the books, and it was unusual for me to do a cover for books like that. Were not narratively attached to the books, so I felt a little guilty about not adhering to my vow to do covers that you could judge a book by. But in the end, you could judge the Lovecraft books by the covers because, he was all about horror. And even though a particular book would have a story that I've always wanted to illustrate, like Pippin's Model or At the Mountains of Madness, my illustration conveyed the feeling of unease and horror, even though it didn't actually have elements from the stories in them. So in 2013, I was approached by Jared Walters, sent to be pressed to do a cover for At the Mountains of Madness. And this time I thought, well, I'll outdo the covers I did in the 80s for Del Rey and come up with something for At the Mountains of Madness that did connect to elements of the story and yet conveyed a feeling of horror. And I've worked on it for 10 freaking years. And it hasn't been until last month that I felt I really came up with a concept that I thought would work for that book cover. But I've done 8 paintings, I think, for that cover. And the publisher has held off on publishing the book all these years, even though he commissioned 8 other illustrators to do interior illustrations. And they got them done in time for their deadlines. I think 1 or 2 may have missed their deadlines and delivered their paintings late, but he's held on to that, and he paid me in advance. The only time in my life I've been paid in advance for a commission, which I really regret now, because I think that influenced me to take my time on it. I just wasn't hitting near the mark. I kept using the wrong colors or creating the wrong scenes, and it just wasn't working for me. And there were a couple of them that Jared liked well enough to want to use for the cover, but I said, I know I can do better. Just hang on. I'm working on another cover painting, and let me get this one done, and this one will beat the one that you're thinking of using. And it hasn't happened till now, so it took 10 years for me to. And so I'm midway through the painting that I know is going to blow all the other attempts out of the water, and it'll be something I'm proud of and will really work for the book cover. So,
do you have any Lovecraft film adaptations that you're a fan of?
No, not really. I've never seen Color Out of Space. That was recommended to me.
That's a great one.
I missed that one, and I hear it's really good. So
I had the director Richard Stanley on here not long ago. It's a great movie.
Yeah, that's on my must-see list. Other ones kind of fell short of the mark for me.
Yeah. So. You mentioned Frank Frazetta earlier. I have to ask if you met him at all.
When I came out here, I wanted to meet him, but I kept thinking to myself, what am I going to say to him? You're awesome. I love your work. I love your stuff. What, I don't, because I have people say that to me, and what else can you say?
Yeah.
How do you do it? I don't know how you do it. It's I don't know how I did the Lovecraft covers. It's so subjective. I've seen several of his paintings. A lot of my favorites I've seen in art shows, and I've been fortunate to get to see them and in people's collections. Some people who collect his work, and I look at it and it's like magic to me. He was born to paint Frazetta paintings, and he's done it, and they're awesome. And he was like a god to the people who came afterwards, people like me. So I was definitely influenced by him. I've got a couple of paintings. There was one in my portfolio that is obviously influenced by his style, but I've been influenced by so many different artists in my time that he was just one of, a spectrum of artists, but can't deny that he was a natural and the forerunner of so much that's been done since his emerging on the scene. I never got a chance to meet him or his wife or his family. So, and the other one I wanted to meet when I came out to the East Coast was Norman Rockwell, and I never got a chance to get up there and see him either. So I missed out on some opportunities. It's because I just kept delaying getting around to doing it.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I got to ask you, you've had a legendary career. You got countless amount of paintings and illustrations. Which would you consider the most challenging? Are there any that you lost sleep over?
Well, yeah, this out at the Mountains of Madness. Yeah. I would like to. I think you could make a book out of all the previous attempts. I've got so much preliminary work I've done for this, trying to find the right key to an image that I think would do the book justice. And, I've got paintings of tentacles and arms and explorers of, their bodies laying in the snow, and their twisted expressions. And I've got heads and screaming explorers, polar explorers. And I've got a mountain of material that could go into a book. What's the word? Showing a map of my obsession with trying to get the right image, or the right image for me that would satisfy me, and all the false paths I went trying to get to this point. It'd be really interesting. I think someone like Stephen King could write a book about somebody like me who has an assignment like this and becomes obsessed with it, with the point that he goes down this rabbit hole and actually becomes mad himself. He can't get quite to the point, and he gets so desperate, that he goes to some really, really wild lengths to try to access parts of his brain or parts of his imagination that aren't normally accessible. So you go through alcohol and drugs and everything, trying to find the right way to approach this project. And, it'd make an interesting story.
Agreed.
Because I could see it happening. I could really see it happening. I teetered on the edge for quite a while. Like I said, I've got notebooks and sketchbooks full of horrible things, attempts to grasp the horror that and the alien architecture of the city that he describes. It's got to look inhuman. And as a human, can I possibly create something like that? Unless I enter a state of mind that's not inhuman, or distorted? That's the question.
There are ways to do that.
Yeah, there's ways to do that, and I won't go into that, but I explored some of that, and it didn't lead me in the right pathway, but I had to give it a shot. So
the college try.
Yeah.
So we kind of touched on this a bit earlier, but I like to ask everyone this because you never know what they're going to say. Have you ever had an experience that you would consider supernatural or paranormal?
Yeah, and I try hard not to believe in it, but I've had a few experiences that stand out. There was one when I was in college. I was laying in bed with my girlfriend and trying to sleep. It must have been like 2:30 in the morning or something, and we heard this noise, and I thought, what the hell is that? This house we were renting, believe it or not, we were renting this house for $75 a month in Cupertino, or a suburb of Cupertino actually, and it used to be a garage, so it was a pretty sketchy place. But anyway, there was this noise, and I listened to it, and I put on a pair of jeans and I walked out barefoot, into the summer night, looking around trying to figure out where this noise is coming from. And I'll never forget, it's like a movie in my head, but I walked out a ways onto this driveway, and I turned around, looked up over my shoulder, and on the roof, on the peak of the roof of the house, were a circle of cats. Must have been 7 to 9 of them, all in a circle, all right, looking at each other, and right over them was the full moon. And I thought, God, this is like right out of a movie. This can't be real. But it was happening. And I was looking up at them, and they all turned their heads and looked at me all together at the same time. They were like talking to each other in this weird cat language, and it was going, and they were looking at me, and they were saying, we're doing our thing and we don't want you interrupting us. And I said, it's okay. Go ahead and do whatever. I'm not going to get in the way of you. And I stepped back and walked quietly back into the house and went into the house. And they went out for a little while longer, and they must have broken up and went their separate ways. So I don't know what was going on. Maybe it was a mating ritual or something, or some kind of full moon thing. But there was a scene in a Stephen King book that was kind of a semi-sequel to the Dark Tower series, where one of his characters comes across a collection of billy bumbers, these fictional raccoon-like creatures that are in the Dark Tower series, where they're in a circle in the moonlight. And I thought, wow, either I told Steve that during one of our conversations about my experience with the cats, or he's experienced it, or he delved into my dreams from some psychic connection or something and saw that image in his head and had to put it in the book. But when I read that scene in that book, it didn't freak me out, but it sent a real shiver up my spine. Just that he made this mental connection and got that into the story. It was really cool. So, and I've had experiences with psychics that are not to be believed. I mean, I hesitate to tell the stories because if you didn't live through it, it's hard to believe that it really happened. But I saw a psychic guy when I was 21 or so, who I heard about from a friend of mine, who drew a floor map of my parents' house, which I'd never seen. They had moved to Colorado. They were living in Littleton again, and I'd never been to their house. And this guy drew a floor map of my parents' house, and he said, "You're going to get an invitation to visit them soon. You should go, because while you're there, you bring good luck to people. Your dad will get a raise. While you're there, you're going to help him finish building this fence he's building in the front of the house. The back of the house, they don't care about because they let their dogs roam around there." I didn't even know that they had a dog. They said there's a big mountain of dirt, in the back and the back left rear of their backyard, and they just let their dogs run around on that. And this room here, he drew a rectangle and said, "This room is your parents' bedroom, but they shouldn't sleep in there because something horrible happened to the family that had the house before in that room." Well, everything happened. I wrote all this down because my friend said, if you go see this guy, he just went by the name Van. He was a Dutch American guy. He said, make sure you take a notebook, because you'll forget half of what he said to you if you don't write it down. And I was writing it down as the guy was in this kind of trance telling me this stuff. And he drew, like I said, this floor plan on this piece of paper, and he told me some other stuff that would happen. And so, I don't know, a couple of weeks later, I got an envelope, a letter in the mail, and it had plane tickets for my parents to go see them. And so I flew out to Denver, and I went to Littleton, to their house, and the fence was there, and I helped them finish building the house while I was there during Easter vacation. They had a dog, the mound of dirt in the backyard. I asked if something happened to the family in the house before, and they said they had a baby that got into a box full of pins that the mother left on, and swallowed the pins in its throat, and had to go for emergency surgery or something to get these needles and pins out of its system. And how can you predict? How could a person get such a detailed vibe, about something that was, so far out of my experience? It wasn't like he could read my mind or get clues from me about what their house looked like, or, whatever. So that was pretty amazing. And once I met a palm reader, first thing she said to me was, "You're an artist." And later I come out and I said to my wife, "Do you see paint on my hands? How I'm not wearing a shirt. I don't have a spot of paint on my..." How'd she know that? And she said, there was another one that said, "You're going to have a baby boy. I see a boy in your future." And I had to laugh because we had a girl at that point. And that's what I wanted, was a girl, a blue-eyed blonde girl. And we got what we wanted. And I was going to go get a vasectomy again. And that's all the kids we wanted. Years later, we did have another child, and we had a boy. It was a boy, and so my mind went back to that prediction, and I thought, I laughed at him at the time and said, "Boy, this guy is bogus," but it really turned out to be true. So I try to keep an open mind. I don't believe in ghosts, and I would love to experience that and say to myself, yes, there's life after death, or there's something after death. But, the jury is way out on that one. And I would need a lot of convincing now to believe in that. But a lot of the paintings I did for myself, the gallery paintings I did in the 90s, were about exploring the concept of a soul or a life after death or the possibility of that. And so it's something that weighs on my mind. And when I think of these fortune tellers and how they could had a sense beyond what we normally experience, that makes the needle in my mind go one direction, but my cynicism, my disbelief go in another direction. So it's tough. We won't know until we experience
Exactly.
it.
As far as life after death goes, it's wait and see kind of deal.
Yeah. Did you ever hear the quote that Stephen King said about when he had a conversation with Stanley Kubrick before The Shining, while The Shining was being made? Kubrick said, "Isn't every ghost story positive because it establishes that, yes, there's life after death. It confirms that in the minds of the people who experience the ghost experience. So whatever horrible thing happens in the mansion, at least you come out of the experience saying, yes, there's a possibility that we're going to, now it could be negative. You go into a hell or whatever, but there's something there, and it establishes that. So every ghost story has a positive connotation of life after death is a happy ending in a way. So that's a weird thought, and Steve didn't know how to react to that. What do you say?
It's the question, is nothingness worse than some hellscape? Which would you prefer?
Yeah.
So what's the best art advice you received in your career, and who gave it to you?
Oh boy, the best art advice I've had is advice I've given myself. I hate to make it sound so egotistical, but learning to trust my own instinct and to have faith that what I do is going to turn out to be worthwhile. That was something I had to discover for myself and create for myself. I sought affirmation from my teachers, and it meant a lot to me to have teachers say, yeah, you got what it takes, you're going to make it. But I always had my doubts and was never convinced that I would until it happened. Never fully convinced of it until it happened. So, I got a lot of good art advice from my favorite teachers. One of my favorite teachers is Maynard Dixon Stewart, who taught at San Jose State Art Department. He was full of great advice. He talked about the core of his teaching is in the phrase, rationalize your vision, rationalize your sight. And what he meant by that was what you're taking in visually, understand how the natural world is creating that image. So whenever you're looking at a face, think of what the back of that head looks like and why the shape of the head is shaped the way it is and why light is falling on it. He was very much into the science behind the art. And I could see how that concept influenced classical artists like Vermeer. There's a scientific explanation for the way he painted the way he did, and it makes it comprehensible and understandable so that it's not totally a subjective experience. But on the other hand, there are masters like, in the music world, Mozart or Paul McCartney, or in the art world, there's people like Frazetta, who seem to have simply a natural subjective talent to create magnificent pieces of work, just out of thin air. I don't know how quite they do it. It's wonderful to watch. I've watched people like Boris and Julie painting, and to me that it's magic. It's really magic. I know they use photographic reference for some of their stuff and everything, but when you're watching them paint, I'm saying, where do you get that color from? I don't see that color in my head. I would go in a different direction, but that's what makes his work, and my work, my work. And when I realized that I'm here to create Michael Whelan's artwork, not a copy of Rosetta's or a copy of Boris's or a copy of Vermeer or a copy of Michelangelo, I'm the only Michael Whelan I know about, and I've got to do the work that I've been put here to do that only I can do. And I can only find that by following my instincts. And so I tell students and people, you're here to create your work. I had a person who was kind of like an apprentice to me briefly, and he had been a Vietnam vet, or he is a Vietnam vet. And I remember, a lot of his early paintings were bad copies of things that I had done. And I would tell him, don't do Michael Whelan paintings. I'm here to do Michael Whelan's paintings. Do your paintings because, you've experienced things that I can't even touch on. I don't know what it's like to wade in a swampy river carrying a gun and being shot at and experiencing death close up. I mean, I have experienced death close up in my own way, through my medical training and stuff. People in accidents, get hurt and and stuff, experiencing horror movies, and stuff like that. But he's experienced in a wholly different visceral way that I can't access. I can try to, but, I didn't experience that. He's lived it and felt it. I said, got to access some of the horror you've experienced. And he was briefly a cop, and he's, had to maintain the scene of an airplane accident, where bodies were burnt and lying there, and he experienced it. He actually experienced it. So, I said, draw on your life, and everybody in the world has got their own personal experiences of things that horrified them or moved them or is a personal issue for them or a family life incident that caused them to withdraw into themselves and find some fantastic escape. So you got to draw on what you've been given as a human being on this earth and incorporate that in your fantasy and your art and make it your own and make it different from everybody else's. I love it when people can do that. There's a guy named Alan Williams. Man, his horror art, his creatures and stuff, are just amazing. I look at him and I say, man, I wish this is the stuff of my nightmares, but I've never drawn upon my nightmares in quite this way and made it so organic like he does. So it's great to see other people's work that express different aspects of the things that I'm into that, I'm not given access to. So it's pretty cool. And there's a lot of good artists out there. Oh my God. There's so much good stuff happening right now. It's just mind-boggling. I can appreciate it, but I've got to do my work.
Well said. A lot of great advice in there. So, Michael, just to put a bow on everything, what's on the horizon for you? What's in the pipeline you can tell us about?
Well, I've got a number of unfinished paintings that have been clogging up my studio, and they just need little changes or additions, and I've been putting them aside because I've been diverted by other projects. And to be honest, this Lovecraft thing has really stymied me. It's been an artistic block that's been on my shoulders for, well, like I said, 10 years. And I still have all the sketches and the previous paintings and the other attempts at doing the covers, on easels and hanging around my studio. And to finally have this thing wrapped up and have it done and give it to Jared and say, this is it. He's seen the comp that I did for the study I did for this painting, and he said, wow, so he's very psyched about it too. This is gonna, oh man, the celebration I'm gonna have after I get that done and delivered. I'll be free to go, and there's at least 3 paintings that I'll want to get done that are waiting to be finished that are personal paintings. I know there's another Brandon Sanderson fantasy novel for me to do a cover for, In the Wings. He's working on it, and I've been waiting for that hammer to fall. So I want to get as much done as I can between now and when that happens. So there's 2 horror paintings that I want to do for myself that express horrific, scary themes related to our relationship to nature and where I see the human race going. But they would work as horror covers, for horror books, definitely. But can't wait to get them done. They're in the pipeline. And so I've got a lot of personal work I want to do. But in the meantime, I'm so full of ideas and everything that it's hard to choose a path. But the path that cleans out my studio and gets a lot of this unfinished stuff out of my life, so I can have space again to expand into other territory. That's kind of what I want to try to get done in 2023.
Well, Michael, it's been a pleasure chatting with you, man. I appreciate you giving me some of your time. I don't have anything else for you.
Well, it's great talking to you, and anytime you want to connect again, I'm all up for it. Got a lot of anecdotes from my medical school days and about people like Meatloaf and whatever. So anytime you want to chat, I'm available.
Oh, we'll definitely have to do it again. Thank you, man.
You're welcome.
You have a great rest of your day, and I'll send you guys a link to this once I get it all polished and prettied up.
Okay, that was fun.
All right,
great talking to you.
You too, man. Bye-bye now.
Bye.
All right, folks, that's a wrap. I hope you enjoyed that chat with Michael. As always, thanks for listening, and we'll see you back next time.
Monsters, madness, and magic.
Welcome to the night. You think you know Night Demon? Then the Night Demon Heavy Metal Podcast is for you. Step into the darkness as we peel back the curtain to give you an unprecedented, all-access look into the mind and the heart of the demon. We're talking band history, song analysis, studio anecdotes, stories from the road. It's everything a diehard Night Demon fan could want and more. This is the only place to learn the inside scoop, the deep dive trivia, the untold tales from the band members themselves and those closest to the Night Demon story. Need more? The Sacred Night Demon Crypt will be pried open to reveal demo recordings that have never before seen the light of day, all with in-depth commentary by the band and the people who were there for the writing and recording process. This is a gold mine, a treasure trove of all things Night Demon. Head over to nightdemon.net or wherever you listen to podcasts. Listen to podcasts.